Unicorns, startups, resilience. This is not Alice in Wonderland, but this is Eurocity's Economic Development Forum. And we'll be hearing some concrete examples of this kind of actions here in Oulu, in other places in Europe, in the panel debate, which we'll be following in the afternoon. So that's something you don't want to miss. But now it is time to move on to our keynote speaker, Martin Sandbu, who is the author of Economics of Belonging and Financial Times' European economics commentator. I would also like to remind you, our dear forum members, that you have the opportunity to send questions in the Deal Room platform chat throughout the speech, and we will be picking them up for Mr. Sandbu at the end of the speech. His keynote is titled The Future of Innovation Ecosystems and Its Role in Recovery. Please welcome Mr. Martin Sandbu. Martin, this is Oulu calling. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Wonderful to hear you and wonderful to see you.
It's wonderful to be with you virtually. I am very sorry we can't meet in person. It would have been wonderful to be there physically, but it's sort of a telling example of where the world is. We're at pretty much the anniversary of the first lockdowns in pretty much every European city. But it is good to be with you in this way, if nothing else. Thank you for having me. It's a bit daunting to be here because, of course, everyone who's listening in will be much more expert on exactly how cities innovate and contribute to innovation than I can be. But I'd like to put what you do in a much bigger social and even historical context. When the pandemic hit Europe and the world, it hit our economies and our societies at a point where we were already undergoing a number of deep crises that required deep and lasting transformation. So we weren't hit by this crisis at a time when everything else was going well. So we had a series of crises and challenges, above all a socio-economic crisis that had been going a little bit unnoticed for many decades, with increasing inequality, increasing regional inequality, and increasing differences between people with different educational backgrounds, a lot of dimensions of increasing divisions and polarizations in the economy. And that crisis, as we know, led to a political crisis, increasing skepticism of how liberal democracy could work, really a democratic crisis that we're already struggling with. On top of that, of course, we had a rapid digital transformation. The socio-economic problems I referred to were not, I don't think, due to globalization, as many people often say, but rather because of the deep technological change in how our economies function, how we produce things. We simply didn't need as many people in factories before. The new leading sectors were those which are particularly good for cities, namely high-skilled knowledge services. But that transformation from industrial society to knowledge society came with a lot of social problems. And because technology keeps developing, this time through digital technology, we were already facing a continuation of these technologically driven challenges. And then finally, of course, on top of the socioeconomic and political and digital challenges, we have the environmental climate change challenge, which it feels very long ago now, but in 2019, there really seemed to be a big moment of really taking conscience of this crisis, where hundreds and thousands, millions of youth demonstrated in our streets, and leaders finally, I think, both in government and in business, realized change has to come and we'll have to lead it. So economic crisis, political crisis, digital challenges, climate crises, all these were already there when the pandemic hit. I think the pandemic has accelerated many of these tensions. Certainly it has done so in the economic domain, where we have seen that the inequalities that were already in place were intensified by the pandemic. It's the people who work in manual services that require physical presence who are already least well treated in many labor markets, paid less, more insecurity, They were also facing greater health risk in the pandemic and greater economic risk, because theirs were the jobs that were more likely to be locked down, whereas people in knowledge services have continued, as I do now, to do most of their work virtually from their home desk in front of a computer screen. So the pandemic intensified many of the underlying tensions, but I think it has also helped in the sense that it's increased our awareness of these tensions. We all understand now that some big change has to be taken. So the greater awareness, I think, means that even as the crisis makes things worse, it also opens up a space for hope, more opportunity for change, for building back better, as we now are all fond of saying. Uh, Disruption is itself an opportunity, because all these crises we're already facing, one reason why we weren't doing enough about them is because big change requires disruptive action. But you know what? We've already been disrupted. We've been disrupted so much. We've gone so much off the ordinary course, what we expected 13, 14 months ago, that this really is an opportunity where we can, instead of going back to where we were, restoring the status quo ante, we really can hope to get back from our disrupted current situation to something better. So I think building back better is not a glib slogan. I think it's a real realistic goal, but of course we have to stick to it and make it happen. And in that process, making that happen, in building back better, cities will really be at the center of the action for many reasons. Cities were already really at the center of many of these underlying crises. The economic change that had driven the political tensions we saw, the technological changes, all of these really affected the role of cities versus more remote areas. The new services, the new knowledge services, are really the sort of industries that do well in cities. In some sense, even though every city has challenges, cities have been at the good end of many of the economic transformations. Um, but of course, cities already had to deal with the big inequalities within them, as well as being affected by inequalities between successful cities and other areas as they fed through national politics. So already cities were at the center of the transformations that called for change. During the pandemic, cities, of course, have been the most affected by lockdowns, because what are cities for? Cities are for a lot of people meeting and interacting and being close together, to exchange ideas, to interact, to socialize. Social distancing is the opposite of what cities are for. So no wonder that cities have been the most disrupted in the past year. But that, I think, is also a spur to creativity, because cities will be at the heart of building back better. And I think this big shock has been a spur for city leaders and city citizens, city dwellers, to think about how we need to change the way our societies, our economies, and indeed our cities work in order to achieve these goals and overcome these crises I've talked about. So I want to talk a little bit about more detail about how cities have to be at the center of these transformations. I mean, one simple reason is that cities will continue to dominate our economies. The people sometimes talk about the death of the cities. I don't believe that at all, because it will still be the sort of knowledge-based industries that thrive in cities that will lead economic growth. So cities will still be at the forefront of economic development. And of course, most people live in cities. In Europe, 3/4 of the population is urbanized, according to UN numbers. So whatever changes will have to happen in cities. Cities are where the action is. And finally, cities are the right size, I think, to try to make change happen. I think of cities, when we talk about cities, as innovative ecosystems. It's a bit of a big phrase. I'd like to think of cities as laboratories for change. Cities are both the scale at which change can be not just thought out and envisaged and imagined, but actually implemented. And cities are the size at which change will be scaled up. I think the transformations we will see, if all goes well, if we manage to build back better, the way we will build back better is for cities to rebuild themselves better and for change to happen, to be scaled up one city at a time. So as we go forward, and I think we see this already happening, cities are engaging with these imperatives of change. Cities are engaging with how we become more digital, how we become greener, how we become more inclusive, and importantly, how we deal with the democratic crisis, how we manage the inevitable conflicts in big social transformation. All of these, you all know, happen at the level of your cities, and you are learning and being the first to learn about how to manage them most successfully. And where you are successful, everyone else will learn from you. I want to share just how this looks in my urban area. I live in the borough of Hackney in London, and what we see here is that as the lockdown hit, but then started to be lifted in the summer, local leaders were aware that if we don't change things or accelerate the changes we're already trying to make, we will find a car-led recovery that will take us back to the past rather than into the future. So there was an acceleration in changing in traffic management, tree planting, and so on. A lot of changes that have changed the traffic picture in my local neighborhood to the better as far as I'm concerned. But of course, it has also created, it has been contested. We have had conflict and political disagreement, all of which is, of course, par for the course. This is how change happens. It's how it should happen. It has to be contested, deliberated about, and then moved forward in a democratic way. You will all have similar stories in your own cities. We're all experiencing this. My point is simply, it is at this local level that the big global changes will end up having happened if we are successful. And if you fail to do it locally, we will fail to do it globally. But I'm quite hopeful, and I'm quite hopeful that European cities in particular are in a good place to lead the way. Why do I say that? Because Europe, of course, is one of the most urbanized regions in the world. North and South America are perhaps slightly more urbanized on UN numbers. But what is special about Europe is the scale of our cities. Europe may be one of the most urban regions in the world, but it's also the region by far whose urban population is concentrated in smaller cities rather than bigger cities. If you look at the share of the urban population that lives in cities that are smaller than 1 million inhabitants, Europe is an outlier. The European city is much more, shall we say, human scaled on the whole than urbanization in other parts of the world. That, I think, is not just what makes Europe Europe, but it's an advantage in the challenges we face today. Because smaller, more manageable cities are nimbler. They are the sort of place where it should be easier to try out new radical change. So I really think that European cities are particularly well suited for being these laboratories for change that will help us build back better, also at a bigger level, national, European, global level. It will happen in cities of European scale. And once some cities succeed, others will try to pick up and copy their successes. Now, what sort of things are we talking about? Of course, again, I'm conscious that you will have much better examples than me from your own cities. But let me share one example where I think this issue of scalability is important, because I really want to encourage you to think of what you do locally in the context of what others can also do. So whenever you experiment, innovate, change your own city, life in your city, social and economic life in your city, always keep in mind how this could inspire or be copied or be scaled up elsewhere. One example I often use, although not so much now that we're all homebound, one of the favorite apps on my smartphone is City Mapper. which is just a fantastic app for using public transport around London. And that has scaled up to many, many other cities in Europe and elsewhere. And it's done that because cities have made open data to open the data on their public transport services. Now, I think there should be hundreds and thousands of examples like that, where something starts in one place and is quite easily transferable elsewhere when it's proved to work in one place. It could be apps, but it could be other things. It could be digital technology for traffic management. How do you use technology in your city for maybe dynamic road pricing, maybe parking regulations in a smart way, any other ways of managing car use? It doesn't have to be digital. It could be how you manage certain political processes or decision processes. It could be how you do planning. But innovation can be so many things. We tend to think of digital, it can be other things, but it's all about how to refashion the way cities work in the post-pandemic era. If people are going to work more from home, how do you rethink city centers? The cities that do best at that will be the examples to follow. Now, to make this as successful as possible, I know you are all working on addressing these challenges in your own cities. I repeat that I encourage you, I plead with you to make that work, make that thinking with scalability and imitation almost in mind. How can you do this in ways that others can also do if you're successful? So don't just think of what works in your city, think about how what you make work in your city can be shared with others. But a lot of this requires action, not at your level, but at national level and European level. At national level, I think it's very important that national policymakers ensure that you, city leaders, have the right authority in terms of planning rules, for example, planning powers, also tax powers, in order to make the sort of changes that are necessary. And depending on the country, this may require reforms at national level to how cities are organized, what powers they have, what reach they have geographically, and how they are taxed and financed. And at the European level, finally, I think it's extraordinarily important that the incentives put in place by the EU institutions are again encouraging innovation, yes, but innovation that can be copied, scaled, transferred from one city that's a pioneer to other cities that can then copy. Because again, what I said holds true, I think, that if we build back better, it will be because we have cities that build themselves back better, and the scale of the change will be one city at a time. And again, the size of the European city is not just what makes them so European, but I think we should see as an asset in our ability to change and to address the transformations we have to undertake. So, I will plead with you to have that in mind as you proceed, both presenting and learning from each other in this conference, but also as you forge ahead with imagining and building the post-COVID city. I encourage you to push both national policymakers and European policymakers to make this easier for you. I will certainly do the same in my writing. And to the extent that national and European authorities and policymakers are listening, let me make that plea to you. Make it as easy as possible for cities, not just to rebuild better at their scale, but think in terms of how what they do can be easily transferred across the cities of Europe. So to sum it all up, to appropriate an old slogan for a new use, really think globally while you act locally, which I know that you are doing. And this is how we're going to build back better. I will end there. Thank you so much for having me, and good luck with this conference, but above all, good luck as you build back better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, for your absolutely fascinating and enlightening keynote. We have a lot of questions already in the chat, but I would like to give the very first question to Deputy Mayor and EDF Chair Pia Pakarinen. What kind of thoughts did Martin's keynote awaken you, and do you have any questions for him?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Martin, very much for this interesting presentation. As a city-level decision maker myself, I could not agree more on the importance of the cities to solve the problems. But guess what? I have your book here. And in this book, you lay out a very interesting policy agenda for the European countries or anyone. And more than an agenda, actually, as the subtitle says here, a radical plan to win back the left behind and achieve prosperity for all. Yet at the same time, in many European countries, governments fail to set the agenda at all or to pass reforms in the fear of populists. The global pandemic is not helping either. How would you encourage us politicians to take steps towards the path you are describing here in this book and also in your presentation? And what would be the first steps?
Well, how much time do we have?
About 12 minutes.
Only the first steps.
Aller Anfang ist schwer, right? The first step is always the hardest. Look, it's hard for city leaders to do what is really in the hands of national and even international leaders to do. In all countries, most power still resides with national governments. But I think I would perhaps be more optimistic than you seem to be in terms of how much the pandemic changed in terms of the willingness of national leaders to do things. Suddenly, everyone has become, willingly or not, a radical. Everything that governments have done in the past year, it's a dimension that was unthought of, unheard of only 12, 13 months ago. So I think everyone has kind of been moved in terms of thinking about what is possible. So I try to, both in the book, which was written right before the pandemic arrived, but I think remains relevant, though I would say that since I want people to read the book. But I wrote in the book that sometimes it's easier to push a big program than small incremental change. Because actually doing a lot of things at the same time, you can have good actions on one area, reinforcing good actions in another area. And I think you're seeing this in some places. You see it in the US. You see it with the Biden administration that has decided we're just going to put everything we have into this. We're going to throw everything we have at the problem. Huge program. And of course, it's an interesting experiment. Now we'll see how it works. But I use it as an example to show how it has been possible to think big in a way that it wasn't before. Now, first steps, there are so many steps, all of which have to be taken at the same time, which makes this difficult. But I would just say, let me say two steps that I think European policymakers need to really keep in mind. One is, don't go small now. Don't take your foot off the accelerator too soon like we did after the global financial crisis. And I mean here macroeconomic policy. There's a lot of emergency support that's been very good. When we come to the end of this year, second half of this year, hopefully the vaccination rollouts will be complete. Hopefully the lockdowns will all be over. That's, I think, a really dangerous point, because then stimulus will be pulled back and we just don't know whether people will still be fearful. Will they want to spend their savings? A lot of people will have run down their savings. We could be in a very fragile place. National policymakers really must continue to support the economy then, because that's something that has to happen at national and international level. You local politicians don't have the means to do that. So that's one thing. But the second thing is, don't fall into the trap of thinking that now that things are difficult is not the time to try to make big change. On the contrary, this is when we should encourage and support big transformations. So think about the green transformation. This is a time to put in place the right incentives for people to go into less carbon intensive ways of producing, ways of moving, ways of consuming. So this is the time to put in place higher carbon prices, for example, while you stimulate the economy. So stimulate the economy while putting in place and accelerating incentives to switch course. These are, very, very broad a very broad agenda, but I think at the very general level, that's the best we can say. Keep pushing, keep encouraging, keep supporting the economy, but accelerate the sort of incentives that we know will switch the direction. So speed up, but keep turning.
Speeding up and thinking big really can create pieces of advice from Martin, and I think all of the participants can take those pieces of advice to their heart. We have about 7 minutes left of the Q&A session. I think we still have some time for a couple of questions from the chat. So Martin, Johan Chikon has asked, what about the role of education in finding strong solutions? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, education is crucial. That's an easy thing to say. It's much harder to make it happen in practice. But as I mentioned in my remarks, the services, the sectors that are leading the economy will continue to lead the economy. High skill knowledge services will still be where most value creation happens. That is good for cities because those services happen to thrive the most in cities once people are allowed to meet again. Maybe there will be some more remote working, in which case cities will have to think about how do you redesign city centers when people just come in once a week or a couple of days a month and so on. But in terms of education, that is where the good jobs are going to be. So we need to think about ways to equip people, both at local level and national level, to work in these services. So education becomes more and more important, but we need to think also new, I think. We should not give up. We should not fall into the trap of thinking, well, there's too much academic education that doesn't suit everyone. I think in terms of what education needs to do now, these sort of abstract problem solving skills that academic training gives continue to be important, and more jobs will involve them. So we need to stick with that. But I think one change that's important is that we need to equip people to relearn things and keep learning throughout their lives. So somehow we need to move perhaps from the old 19th century model of 3 or 4 years in university, just as you're around 20 years old, to a system where we can keep refilling, redeveloping our knowledge over time. So I think, don't think that we need to go away from abstract problem-solving skills, generalizable skills, the ability to learn new things. All of this remains important, but we need to find new ways of organizing it, I think, that goes towards lifelong learning.
Thank you, Martin. We have a lot of questions coming up in the chat, but we're also, because it's an interesting discussion, time flies, and it seems that we won't have more time to ask these questions from the chat. But as you know, in the Deal Room platform, you can also contact Martin and ask these questions again. So please use it. But Martin, as a sort of a closing remark for you, I would like to ask: we have over 50 cities represented in the forum, nearly 300 participants, and you already said that things need to speed up. So what could we do within this forum right now to enhance collaboration and take those first big steps that you already talked about?
I need to remember to unmute myself. The best I can say, I think, is to encourage you all to be bold. This is not the time to be fearful of change. Of course, change is scary, but we know that change is coming, and it's much better to be at the forefront of it and to lead it than to be behind it and be overcome by change. So, you need to be bold. You need to try to really make these changes that I think you all know will have to come: redesigning cities, rethinking mobility, greening and digitizing interaction within cities. You need to double down on those. But I think what's particularly crucial is for you to use your abilities, your organizations, your skills, your political skills, to manage conflict, because we know there will be conflict with these changes. There are always some losers. There are always people who are right to be fearful that change will not benefit them. And I think perhaps the most important and most risky bit of this is how do you democratically and socially manage the very natural contestation of change. So don't forget the democratic, long-winded, talking to people bit of change. There will be a lot of people who are very good at policy thinking. What are the policies that will work? Don't forget the political, the very important political aspect of these. And your leaders, certainly elected leaders, but also technocratic leaders, be willing to go out there and explain again and again and again how it will work, how you will ensure that there aren't too many losers or the losers don't lose too badly, because the political management of this change is just crucial. Otherwise, we will run into problems very soon.
Pia, a very short comment from you. Do you have a clear view of what you're going to do right now after hearing the keynote, Martin's answers, even to your question? What is going to happen in Helsinki during and after the conference?
I think I feel even more empowered to do something, and of course, well, later on the panel you'll hear what we are going to do in Helsinki, and I think this was a very good presentation to give us strength in our struggle against the pandemic and to recovery after that.
And I'm quite sure the participants in the forum are also feeling empowered. So thank you, Pia, for your questions. And then also a big thank you to Martin Sandbu, author of The Economics of Belonging and Financial Times' European economics commentator. Thank you so much for joining us, Martin.
Thank you so much for having me. Good luck.